Good evening and a warm welcome to those attending the Major Applications Planning Committee and to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. My name is Councillor Steve Tuckwell and I am the Chairman of this evening's meeting. Details of the business to be considered today are shown on the agenda, copies of which are accessible online underneath the live broadcast. For those present in the room and intending to speak, please note that you will be filmed and any statements you make will be recorded and made public. A reminder, I don't think I need to remind members, but a reminder anyway, is that anyone speaking today, your voice will only be audible if the microphone is switched on. In terms of a fire alarm, we are not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm does go off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For mobile and tablet devices, can I ask that they are switched off or put to silent before the meeting starts, so that members will know that councillors and committee members, officers, may be using their laptops during the meeting to view the agenda paperwork. In terms of meeting feedback, we haven't got anybody in the public gallery, but there is an online form underneath the broadcast and you can fill in feedback on this evening's meeting. Okay, that's the Chairman's announcements. I'm now going to introduce both councillors and officers attending this evening's meeting. And we have Councillor Higgins, who's the Vice Chairman. Good evening. We have Councillor Duncan, the Opposition Lead. We also have Councillor Chapman, Councillor Cawthorne, a welcome to Councillor Mathers, and we have Councillor Yarrow. So those are the voting members this evening. But we're also joined by a team of officers who support this evening's proceedings. So I have the Deputy Director of Planning and Regeneration, James Roger. I have our Specialist Planning Manager this evening, Ian Thine. We have our Strategic and Major Planning Officer, Mandit Malhotra. We have our Legal Advisor this evening, Glenn Egan. And the person who wraps up and keeps us all in check is our Democratic Services Officer this evening, Steve Clark. So that's all the officers and voting members introduced. We can now go into the main body of the agenda. So agenda item 1, Steve, apologies for absence.
No apologies for absence this evening, Chairman.
Okay. Thank you. Agenda item 2 this evening is declarations of interest in matters before this evening's meeting. Any declarations of interest? Can't see any. Okay. Agenda item 3 is to receive and agree the minutes of our last meeting, which was the 23rd of February. Can I take it that they're agreed? Okay. Steve, we can note that those are agreed. Agenda item 4 is matters notified in advance or urgent, which we haven't got any. And agenda item 5 this evening is to confirm that all items are in part 1, which is public. We don't have any part 2 private items, and we have agendas items 6, 7 and 8 will be taken in that order this evening, and we have no petition items. Okay, that's the Chairman's announcements and introductions dealt with. So we can now move on to agenda item 6, which is HS2 application for land at Newyears Green Lane and Breakspear Road South, and I'm going to hand over to Ian Thine to take us through that application.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, councillors. So agenda item 6, land at Newyears Green Lane, Breakspear Road South, Ickenham Harefield Way, in the north of the borough. So the development description tonight, the works before us will consist of the erection of 2 mounds, eastern and western mounds, approximately 18 metres and 16 metres in height, the diversion of an unnamed ordinary watercourse, the provision of swales around the mounds to capture surface water runoff, the provision of a new pond connecting new swales around the eastern mound designed to attenuate water flow before discharge into another existing unnamed ordinary watercourse along Breakspear Road North. The proposed pond will be connected to existing pond, West Breakspear Road South, by a new culvert under footpath U38. So in terms of the development, the western mounds on the land immediately to the north of Newyears Green Lane rising to a height of approximately 16 metres above existing ground level at its highest point, using approximately 209,000 cubic metres of material. The eastern mounds on land immediately to the north of Newyears Green Lane and west of Breakspear Road South rising to a height of approximately 18 metres above existing ground level. So that's the eastern mound, on the top of the western mound. Location plan for you here, so you can see Newyears Green Lane just to the south of the 2 red line areas, in between what is a fairly industrial agricultural area with West London composting directly in the middle. So in terms of approval tonight, the application has been made under Schedule 17 of the HS2 Act, paragraph 7, conditions relating to waste and soil disposal and excavation. And as we know, Chair, these are not straightforward matters. there's effectively two proposals tonight. One is submitted under subparagraph 7, which relates to the design or external appearance of disposal sites and the methods by which the disposal sites are constructed. There are grounds under subparagraph 8 that we're familiar with that we can consider to preserve the local environment, local amenity, prevent prejudicial effects on road safety and archaeological and historic interest as per normal. However, in this instance, these are disapplied because the site is listed under elsewhere in the Schedule 5 of the Act. So, in theory, we're only allowed to consider basically the methods by which these are constructed. And you'll see in the written statement from HS2, they've majored on this element of it, and they've explained how those grounds for consideration are disapplied. However, the second part of the approval is under subsection of subparagraph 8, which basically allows us to consider land restoration. And I'll read this bit out. The consideration for us is the relevant planning authority, Hillingdon, may only refuse to approve or impose conditions on the approval of a scheme for the purposes of this paragraph, i.e. the restoration, on the ground that the scheme ought to be modified and is reasonably capable of being modified. So if we consider what we're allowed to, what is before us tonight, in terms of the restoration, it's actually fairly open. So we have, if we're not happy with flood risk, for example, or not happy with the way that the site's being restored in terms of its design, then I believe under the restoration proposals under subsection 8, we are entitled to raise those concerns. So that's basically how officers have approached this. This application's been in the pipeline for some years now while we've tried to rectify some of these problems, and we'll go through those in a bit more detail in due course. But just to clarify that the written statement sort of indicates that the authority doesn't have much say in this, but in reality under subsection 8 I think we do. So in terms of the general overview, you've got two mounds, eastern and western mound. The eastern mound is the western mound is on the left of the screen is the slightly smaller mound, less height, 16 metres, and the eastern mound is 18 metres above ground level. Come on to some of the heights and landscape and contours in a minute. And there you can see the two mounds. The area being used is more than actually the final restoration. That's because of the extra land take they need for storage of material and movement of muck. Now the material will be taken across the conveyor, which we'll come on to in a second, from a site nearby to the south. This is all done on internal haul roads and the use of a conveyor belt, so there's no movement of vehicles on the road network. Now the reason these two mounds are being presented is to effectively get rid of material for HS2 so that it doesn't go on a local road network. If these mounds weren't in close proximity to the works, the main works, then that would result in significant amount of HGV movements on the local road network to go along with all the other significant amount of HGV movements already on the local road network. So basically they've commandeered land to get rid of muck, in a sense, and this was approved by Parliament. So just to give a bit more of the context there, if we look at the screen and HS2 in its totality in the borough, starting at the right of the screen, you've got the vent shaft and the HS2 in tunnel as it goes under Ruislip, and then moving out towards the Colne Valley. And we'll get to number 6 on this list here, which is the soil dumping. HS2 call it sustainable placement, but we all have our own different take on whether or not it's truly sustainable. That position was made by the council to Parliament, so I'm not saying anything untoward there, Chair. Tunnel portal at Ruislip Golf Course, so that's when it becomes above ground and you start to get the construction impacts associated with that tunnel. So everything underground, there's very little impact apart from obviously utility works, which are ongoing at the minute. But as soon as you get to the surface area, there is quite a lot of disturbance to the land. And you can see the yellow areas there where there will be significant amount of soil dumping. And you would have seen the last time we had an item before this committee, it was for the Copthall Tunnel. Now the Copthall Tunnel is a section between Breakspear Road South and Harville Road, which effectively it's not a bored tunnel, it's an open dug tunnel, and then it's filled in at the top. So when it's complete, it looks like landscape area, and it's and HS2 goes underground. Now, to dig out that land, in the first instance, will generate a lot of muck. So if we're standing where the star is, the orange star looking along that arrow, this is drone footage taken recently of the area. You can see all this is the material from Copthall Tunnel. So you can see the Chiltern line to the left. So this is effectively looking sort of due west out towards the Colne Valley. Harville Road is just at the top of that screen. This is the area that was, until about 5 years ago, covered in trees. But this is the area that's basically going to be dug out to create Copthall Tunnel. This material has to go somewhere. It's going to go on this conveyor belt, cross Newyears Green Lane, so you can see the little map at the bottom right-hand corner where we're talking about. All the movement of muck in this area is internal haul road, so no road-borne traffic. Gets to the start of this conveyor belt here, gets taken across Newyears Green Lane, so that reduces the need for traffic crossing Newyears Green Lane and disturbing what is already a fairly interesting road. And then across on the conveyor belt where it gets dropped off, and there you start to see the commencement of the preparation work for the sustainable placement areas which we're talking about tonight. So that gives you the context. What was approved by Parliament? Well, initially this was the scheme that was all going to be tipped on. So this is quite a sizable area, but it was up to 3 metre high mounds. So the intention was that it would probably given back to agricultural land as it is at the minute. Some of you might notice that in 2016 there's a sizable change in the middle there. It's because eventually someone went out on site and discovered that the West London composting site, West London's most vital, important composting site, sat right in the middle of that. So they decided to move around it. Subsequent to this, just to reiterate, even at this point we were talking about 3 metre high mounds. So subsequent to this, we've moved on to a new proposal, new landform, similar amount of material involved, but it's a reduced footprint, but they're higher mounds. So they're now at 16 metres and 18 metres high, which is a fairly substantial change to the existing landscape, but I'll just come on to that in a bit more detail because in reality it sort of blends in with what is already a fairly hilly area. So this is the general arrangement plan for the eastern mound. It's about a 1 in 3 slope rising to a 1 in 1.5 towards the top, so it gets a bit more steep at the top. But at the end of the day, it's a fairly gradual slope, 18 degrees in steepness. Similar with the eastern mound. Similar to the eastern mound, this one is slightly bigger, and you'll see that there are various changes to the landform there, and that's because there are utilities where there's easements, so you can't build on top of those. There's also footpaths that go through the middle of their public rights of way, and the mound on the eastern side, the council has secured a footpath going up to the top of the larger section on the eastern side, or the western side of the eastern mound. So that's the general landform. If we look at the cross sections in a bit more detail to see exactly what this means in terms of landscape, although they are 18 and 16 metres high, which is a change from the approved 3 metres, and on the face of it, that's a bit of a shock. I think once we see it in its landform in this in a sort of carefully sculpted way, these aren't prominent hills as such. So they are very gently sloped over a fairly large footprint, and they will be landscaped heavily. I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a section. So if we look at the existing area, there is already quite a number of raised areas. So Bayhurst Woods to the top, and then just above that is Mad Best Woods, which is even higher. So I've illustrated this on the OS contour map, and knowing the technology here, I've drawn over the contours in squiggly lines, so that's what they are, but they follow the natural contours. And you can see right at the top there, Mad Best Woods, 90 metres from a 50 metre base. So you get there's already a fairly, hilly landform here. Bayhurst Woods, 80 metres from a 60 metre base, and then in general, it's about 40 to 50 metres around. So these new landforms will be starting at 50 metres, going up to 65 towards the 70 on the eastern mound. So it sort of fits within what is already a fairly hilly landscape. It's not too prominent as far as we're concerned. And here we see some of the visuals at the top, as it is now, year 1, and then with the established planting year 15 at the bottom. So you can see, again, the mound at the middle from the top. You can see a clear noticeable difference, but again, it's not, officers don't think it's overly visually intrusive. And again, another change here to the landform. You can see in the middle there the mound rising quite steeply, and then covered by hills covered by trees at ground level. And finally, from another perspective there. So in terms of draining, one of the key issues is obviously what happens to the runoff. You change the landform. There's a series of swales around the base of each of these mounds to capture the runoff. HS2 are only required to capture the runoff from the mounds. They're not required to improve the situation from what it is now. That's unlike normal planning applications. That is a requirement of the Act. And they've done that through a series of swales and ponds, and officers are generally happy that there is that the process for capturing the water will not increase the risk of flooding elsewhere. There is a separate consenting arrangement for the diversion of the ordinary watercourse, which will ensure that that doesn't increase the risk of flooding as well. And again, just to illustrate, the blue areas on there are the swales that capture the water. So in terms of council's officers' concerns, the key for us is to make sure that this isn't just simply HS2 effectively throwing material over its shoulder and then moving on. You know, at the end of the day, these are going to be left to the council. They're not going to be, because of the steepness and the context on them, they're not going to be used for agricultural use. So they're not going to be farmed. So as a land use in London Borough of Hillingdon, if we don't do something positive with them, they're just mounds for someone to look after, and then that becomes a problem for antisocial behaviour such as dirt biking and things like that. So what we've achieved on the western mound is a footpath up to the top of the mound. There is still an area of discussion with HS2 about who will actually take these on at the end of it. So in terms of tonight, we're trying to get to the right design for planning and the right land use, and hoping to secure the ability to be able to present something to a landowner at a future date that the council is happy with in terms of a land use. And we think we've reached that certainly on the western mound. The eastern mound was a bit more complicated because historically it was going to be returned to the existing landowner, and there are undertakings and assurances given as to what that would look like. That landowner has subsequently moved on, so it's now vested by the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State effectively effectively owns both mounds, but has intentions to return the western mound back to the local authority, because that's our land, which we would then maintain and manage. The eastern mound has no long-term plan at the minute, and that was a concern for the council. If it doesn't have a long-term plan, there's no vision for it, it just becomes a mound. And because HS2 are obviously aware of the potential for antisocial behaviour, it's effectively fenced off from public interaction, which is obviously a concern. It's just a HS2 mound that no one can do anything with. So we've reached a resolution on the condition. I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a second. So just to give some, because I know this might be on some of the councillors' minds, Northala Fields is a sort of pretext for this. This is the A40 mounds that you see that were used for, or that were created as a consequence of the Wembley construction. These all have footpaths up to the top, and these are very heavily used. It provides a nice reference point, but it's not what we're trying to go for, or not what officers and HS2 are aiming to put in on the Northern Sustainable Placement mounds. It's something similar. Their footprint is a lot wider, they're a lot more shallow. We have secured footpath up to the top of the western mound. We're still trying to achieve that on the eastern mound. So in terms of the consideration, going back to what's before us under paragraph 7, methods for construction. So as far as we're concerned, officers are happy with the way that the method for construction has been presented. There is a whole scope of contract arrangements through the Code of Construction Practice, which we've discussed before at this committee, which ensures that HS2 have to do this correctly. And also to reiterate, a lot of this work is being done on class approval under paragraph 5 of Schedule 17. Now, the class approval is effectively prevents HS2 having to come to local authorities with every time they want to put in some dust suppression or to do handling of material. So a class approval is effectively conditions already put on planning applications by the Secretary of State. And because it's already planning condition of the works, that's enforceable under the Town and Country Planning Act. So if we're not happy with dust suppression, for example, in this instance, we can take enforcement action under the Town and Country Planning Act. And that's the same for a variety of other measures that are factored in under the class approval. So in terms of method for construction, officers are generally happy with what has been presented. The final end use and restoration is a little bit more complicated, as I talked about, particularly on the eastern mound. So as a consequence, the recommendation is approval subject to the condition on the screen. Now, as with most of these, we don't have to get agreement from HS2, although it's always beneficial to avoid going down the appeal route. So this condition was proposed by HS2, tweaked by officers, and accepted by both parties. And what this condition does is allows for more work to be done on the restoration and obviously securing a future landowner as well. So in terms of the western mound, we're nearly there. There is still work to be done on the landscaping. The final planting regime, as you'll see, some of the landscape comments were required a bit more information on the types of trees. And certainly on the eastern mound, there is a requirement to do a lot more work with some of the final restoration measures. And at this stage, we don't have a future landowner in mind. Certainly, the Secretary of State hasn't got one. But the intention would be to probably hand it across to hopefully a wildlife organisation or something akin to that. That still has to be worked up, which would require a different level of landscaping. So the landscaping scheme, the final restoration, is still to be decided, and that's what this condition does. So that's the recommendation from officers, approval subject to essentially a landscaping scheme to be agreed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ian. Members will be aware there's a lot to take in there, very technical, and so thanks to Ian for unravelling and that for members this evening. But before we go open to the debate, I'm going to invite Glenn to sort of talk us through the usual sort of implications from a legal perspective that we have to bear in mind when we're determining this application this evening. Over to you, Glenn.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. As the committee will know, the Council's room for manoeuvre here is very limited indeed. However, you are entitled, the first thing I would say is, are you happy with the information you've been given? Do you think you have enough information from HS2 to make a decision tonight? If you don't, potentially we can have a discussion. I can provide further advice at a future time tonight. But if you feel unhappy with the information you've been given by HS2, you may be entitled to ask for further information. But looking at the legal implications on page 22 and 23, as was mentioned in the presentation from Ian there, where the Council has room for manoeuvre tonight is in paragraph 8 of Schedule 17, able to impose a condition relating to the restoration of the land. What I'd ask committee to do is to take a look at the draft wording of the condition there. I can recommend that for acceptance by the Council, by the committee. It does seem to protect the Council's interests, enable us to negotiate some potential future use for the public of that land and to deal with issues that arise. So I can recommend that for acceptance, but it's really for councillors then to judge whether they're happy with that wording as well. It's also repeated on page 8 of the agenda, if that helps as well. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for that, Glenn. Always good to have a legal perspective when we're discussing these issues. So before we go to the debate, and I've had a couple of councillors indicate they want to speak already, I think it's worth noting, members have sat here before, and we are constrained heavily on HS2 matters. As frustrating as that is for some of us, for some members, it is the legal position that we find ourselves in. So on that note, I'm going to invite Councillor Cawthorne, who indicated first, to ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. I've got a couple of questions. The one is on the recommendation that's before us. That's the one thing that we seem to have any leeway over, according to the briefing. And that's really around bearing in mind what the Borough Solicitor has said on page 23. Do we have enough information to make a decision? I just want to make sure I'm clear on what's being said with this recommendation, because clearly there are concerns about ASB. There are existing problems with ASB in this part of the world. It's not far from my ward boundary. So that's clearly an important consideration. Is it enough to simply say, well, there's a general intent to go away and work up a solution to this that people are happy with? Do we have that yet? It would be helpful just to understand where we are with it. Is it sufficient to be to have that really sewn up at this stage, or is it enough simply to say, well, do you know what, we're going to go away and see what we can do about it? That's my first question, because there is a problem in this part of the world, without a doubt, already. My second question, I can anticipate you saying this is not within our remit, but I noticed that when it talks about the design aspects, and certainly the method of construction that you said officers are happy with, I couldn't see anything related to the construction, or rather the stability of this, given the increasingly frequent, intensive rainfalls that we have nowadays. And I just want to be satisfied that that's been taken account of somewhere in the process. And the last thing, and it really is a tongue-in-cheek thing, to be honest, I was amused by the reference on page 7 to benefits to the Hillingdon residents. I wasn't aware that was a requirement of these things. If only it had been, that would be something we could have had some fun with. But I'm not expecting a comment on that, but on the first 2 points, if you wouldn't mind, please. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, so if I could just invite Ian to come in, and I think the answer to the first question is sufficient information. I'm sure Ian will say, you know, he's done a lot of work, and his team have done a lot of work on this, and that's why they come to committee with such precision, because the work's been done. But I'm going to let Ian pick up the issue around sufficient information, and obviously the design, and particularly the stability of the mound. So if you could pick those up, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor. I think the first thing to say on the sufficiency of information, I think we have enough information to get us to the point where this condition is effective. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, just to come back on, you know, the time it takes. You know, we as officers, we're always put in a bit of a difficult situation with these as well, because we have HS2s telling us, well, if we don't approve things like this, or we don't move things on, then we're holding up a massive major infrastructure project, and it's going to cost taxpayers lots and lots of money. So, you know, we do have to be mindful of that. There is programme pressures from them, but notwithstanding that, we haven't reached the solution on the restoration yet. So the condition before us tonight is the compromise. In terms of antisocial behaviour and the types of restoration, we also have to be mindful that if we wanted to refuse it, we would have to present something that could be modified. And the question is, what would be modified it to reduce those impacts? Now, the problem is we don't have any future landowners waiting in the wings. So whatever we modified it to, those issues would still remain. There would still be that, in effect, that threat of antisocial behaviour, because there still wouldn't be an end land use that I'd be able to present to you. So we would still have some sort of condition, even on a modified scheme. What officers think is that what has been presented to us in terms of the final landform has potential to be a really good resource for residents. You know, there is a potential there to be for biodiversity improvements to filter into Bayhurst Woods, for example. So you've got this network. You have a footpath up the western mound, which will be an interesting new landscape, a new and interesting area. I mean, the area was dairy farm pretty much. There's also some interesting land uses across Newyears Green Lane. So this is a nicer landscape that protects some of that area. So in terms of that, I think the officers believe that this is the right kind of end product to get us to this condition, and it's just tweaking it at the end. So I think in those regards, I can't see us modifying it any further. This condition effectively will seek those modifications. Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, we have to remember that the principal reason here is this amount of material reduces a lot of lorries on the road network, so that is also a factor in that. So if it was to be reduced in height, that would have the unfortunate consequence of probably increasing the amount of vehicular movements. In terms of stability, it's a very good point. The issue of stability is picked up through the Code of Construction Practice, and there's a phased approach in the method statement submitted with the application, which talks about how it's actually going to be created. There's a lot of compaction in it, so it's not just loose material that's waiting to be landslipped. And what happens is, once it's complete, there is a settling in period. So it's not handed back to landowners immediately on day one and so there you go, good luck. There is a period of up to about 5 years where HS2 are effectively gatekeepers of this land. So they are there to check on to make sure there isn't stability issues, landslips, so on and so forth. So hopefully that answers those questions, Councillor.
Okay, you okay with that,
I'm
Councillor?
indeed, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Higgins, you indicated.
Thank you, Chairman. A lot of what you've already, Ian, well done, trying to make it easier to understand. I like the irony about how we're going to cost them money and the taxpayer when they've actually pilfered the pot. Anyway, we won't go there. All I'm concerned with, there's two questions I want to know. That obviously being in my ward, there was a lot of trees removed. Do we know what quantity of trees were removed? And if so, that's going to be probably the first thing I'd say is I want those put back in that order. I've noticed that I like the reasons and the scheme outline modified, but I'm going to ask you a few questions just to make sure that things are in there. Okay. Firstly, as I said, I think the trees, if we remove that many trees, we should be at least putting the same back or more. I like the fact that you're putting some oak there. You already talked about access to public on one of the sites, but you've told me that you're trying to work on that one, so that our question was answered. The thing I think that for me is that last word, biodiversity corridors, does that cover things like marshland and wildlife? Because I think this is a perfect opportunity. I know they're not meant to help us, because then that's not their style of doing things, but if we can make sure that we are very clever in what we asked for and how it's done, because I know that the area does get flooded a lot in that area, so I would like, if they've got those swirls, to be a lot deeper than they are, and maybe creating some marshland and stuff like that. And as long as that biodiversity corridor covers those aspects, then I'm not happy with it anyway, but I'm happy with what we have to do here. Yeah.
Okay, so just to paraphrase what Councillor Higgins came up with there, so, and I think the condition that's been secured here with a lot of work that's gone in discussions actually gives us the flexibility to pick up a lot of the points that have been raised by Councillor Higgins, but I'll let you address those points that have been picked up. So we've got renewal and removal of trees and biodiversity corridors.
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely right, Councillor, on the removal of trees. The HS2 are required to come up with a no net loss scheme in terms of biodiversity. That doesn't necessarily mean the loss of one tree equals the creation of another, and it doesn't necessarily mean the loss of one tree is planted in exactly the location where it can possibly be. So in this area, there was a limited amount of, what you would say, quality, ecology, habitat lost. But what we have seen elsewhere in the area is a lot of trees removed that won't be put back in those particular areas, for example, on top of the Copthall Tunnel because of things we've talked about in the past. We're still working out the vision with HS2 as to what that no net loss looks like. So what has been lost in its totality, what has to go back and where. Does 1 hectare of trees equal another hectare of trees, or does it equal grassland, marshland, ponds, so on and so forth, to get more of a biodiverse habitat? You're absolutely right, Chair. The condition allows us to come up with that scheme. And the important thing about this condition is it is flexible enough for whatever landowner comes forward at the end of it. And it might be the council, it might be a wildlife group, we don't know. It all depends on obviously what HS2 are prepared to put in their coffers and pull out at the end of the day as to what management is attached to it. But in terms of planning, we want to get into a position where we've got those factors covered off. So in terms of flooding, it's a slightly difficult one. As I said in the presentation, there is no requirement on us to make HS2 go above and beyond what is already the current situation. The current situation, completely agree, isn't acceptable on Breakspear Road South. HS2 are effectively required to make sure it doesn't get any worse, but it's not going to get any better. That said, we have reached agreement with HS2 elsewhere in the local area. So across Breakspear Road South, where there's a lot of flooding on the sustainable placement site to the south, in between Breakspear Road and Harville Road, and there's land elsewhere that Secretary of State owns that we have now secured commitment from HS2 will be put back, will be restored for flood mitigation. So what we're trying to achieve here is to reduce the amount of runoff into the River Pin, which then floods down further down Breakspear Road South. So whilst I can't present that as part of this scheme tonight, what I can say is that there is a commitment from HS2 working with the council to reach that position where there is betterment achieved through alternative routes. So hopefully that satisfies that. I'm not able to give you the full details of that yet, but certainly that will hopefully come forward in due course.
Do you want to
Thank you, yeah.
come back, Councillor Higgins?
Yes, Chairman. Yeah, please. Ian, can you just sort of like what it's the chicken and egg situation? Which comes first? Does the landowner be allocated before the planted system, or does the council have to come up with basically two options, one for wildlife and one for? How does it click in? And obviously, when does that come back to committee, or does that just deal with officers?
Well, in terms of the submission for the condition, I suppose, Glenn, Chair, if you request that to come back to the committee, then it can do. As an officer, I assume you can make that recommendation. So that covers off that. In terms of the chicken eggs, it's absolutely right. I mean, in most instances where HS2 have temporarily taken possession of land, they give it back to that landowner with a land management. Where they've vested the land, they've taken it in its entirety, then they, under the Crickhall Downs rule, I think it is, Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, they're required to offer the previous landowner in the first instance, and if that landowner turns around and said, no, I don't want, I used to farm, I used to have cattle here, but now it's a bunch of trees, I don't want anything to do with it, then Secretary of State has a land disposal issue. Now, we know that Secretary of State doesn't want to own lots of land. They're currently in the process of owning lots of land in this area, and then they'll want to come back to various organisations to see how they can dispose of it, because ultimately they're the ones who then have to manage it, whether that, that's illegal incursions or whatever, and antisocial behaviour, so on and so forth. So they want to dispose of the land, and obviously if they can't find a private landowner, probably the local authority will be the next place they come to. So assuming that there's land management processes in place, and we've reached agreement on that, then whatever we agree as part of the planning is what's given to the landowner. It's essentially what we're saying. So that's what we're going to get to with this condition, is what we're happy with, and then they'll have to find a landowner that is happy with that land restoration. So that's the chicken and egg situation.
Okay, thank you. Some good discussions there, but I think when we talked about, when it was mentioned about this item returning to committee, I was getting a lot of nods from around the table, so I think we're all happy with that, to have that captured in the minutes. That will take place at some point, whenever that will be. Councillor Duncan, you indicated.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I received some information very late this afternoon that I've not been able to share with anybody, but anyway, it results in me asking a few questions. It's about any contamination of this land, because apparently it's next to Newyears Green landfill site, which is a contaminated area, and the pollution has not been contained within the landfill site, so it's actually, leached out into adjoining land. And no mention of this has been made in the environmental assessments of landfill contamination, and it is a significant factor. So that's the first issue. The second issue, and that I think really needs to be answered before it goes on to the next issue, which is about the contamination of water source. And I don't know if this is something you've examined, Ian, but it says the application sites within the Inner Source Protection Zone, SPZ1, for Ickenham public water source. The public water source is contaminated from the landfill site, which lies the other side of the work site, which is the subject of the application. And I think the water regulations apply. They were just, just transferred over. So they do apply to HS2. HS2 can't disapply them, I understand. And it's talking about what this is going to do, because apparently at the moment the Ickenham source is under derogation from being at good chemical status by 2015 to be improved and be at good chemical status by 2027. And these works, it's claimed, will have some effect on that. So it's really, is there contamination? Do we know about that? How much? how is it going to affect the water sources which are already identified as contaminated, the Ickenham water sources, and is in a programme for that to be improved, certainly to be somehow got to good status by 2027. So those are the first things. If I could just ask about those, please.
Yeah, if you could pick up the contamination points that were raised there, Ian, thanks.
No problems at all. Thank you, Councillor. So the site you're talking about is Newyears Green Lane landfill site. It's a special site under Part 2 of the Contaminated Land Act. That is a known contaminated land site. It's in the council ownership. However, the Environment Agency were consulted on this. They're the lead regulator on protection of the water environment. They've raised no objection with this. Furthermore, Parliament has approved through the royal assent of the Act, they've approved for this area to be tipped. So it's not within the council's remit now to then raise questions about the principle of tipping on this land, because that has effectively been secured through what is the outline planning consent, i.e. the HS2 Act. What we're talking about now is the design of it and whether or not we're restoring the land in a way that fits with those principles that have been signed off by Parliament. The second issue is no contamination of the ground has been identified from the Environment Agency through this. The contamination is already in the landfill site to the west. This doesn't increase the risk associated with that. Well, there's no movement of that. This isn't work in that contaminated land site. So this isn't interfering with that contaminated land site. This is some distance to the east of it. So there is no increased risk from that contaminated land site associated with these proposals. That's the Environment Agency's position. Furthermore, the Environment Agency permit this under the environmental permitting regs, so they're responsible for regulating the impacts on the water environment, and also the protection of the aquifer. The Ickenham water stream isn't actually abstracting for public water supplies at the minute. It's been turned off a long time. So again, there's no impact on the Ickenham public water supply from the contaminated land site at the minute. So in terms of what is before this committee tonight, the Environment Agency raised no objection as the lead regulator for protection of the water environment, and the principle of tipping material in this area has already been established. So there's no more to say on that, Chair. That's the position that we're in. We're put in that position by Parliament. So as far as we're concerned, the risk to the water environment is, I don't believe there is risk to the water environment. The environment hasn't raised anything, but there's a question as to whether or not we would even be able to use that as a ground for refusal of this permission at this stage, given Parliament's position on the HS2 Act.
I think, again, that just illustrates the point I made earlier about how constrained we are on these applications, but if you wanted to come back on that, Councillor Duncan?
Absolutely, yes, bound hand and foot. When you said that the Ickenham source has been turned off, is that because it was not good and needed to be improved, and so they didn't want that to be used as part of the supply because of the existing contamination?
I believe that's the case, yes. But that's a matter for Affinity Water and the Environment Agency. The fact of the matter, and that's not before associated with this application.
Do we know how much of that, sorry to interrupt you, but do we know how much of that information was taken into account? Presumably there was very detailed work on contamination and water sources for such a huge project when it went through Parliament. Is that our understanding? As
part of the environmental impact assessment, there is a requirement to consider the impacts on the water environment. So that was...
Which this doesn't do.
Well, it was approved by Parliament. Environment Agents were involved in the process. So as far as what's before the committee tonight, I can't comment and I can't argue with what a decision was made back in effectively 2017.
I know we can't. Yeah, I know we can't argue about it. But I'm just wondering if that information was put forward at that time.
Yeah. But I think it's a question of what's in front of this committee this evening.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is it something that we do need to be concerned about? If you're talking about water supplies being turned off because of contamination, and now you're talking about, I know they've got permission to tip, to dump, but, you know, in the end, we have to make a comment about that, don't we? That's what we're here for. And if a water source is being turned off because of this situation, how concerned do we need to be? Whether we can do anything about it or not is another matter, and maybe that has to go down another legal avenue. I don't know.
I think we can certainly capture the points you're raising this evening, but I'm going to ask Glenn to come in and just try and help us along a little bit on this one.
Chairman, thank you. There is a legitimate concern there raised by Councillor Duncan, but unfortunately it's not within the committee's remit tonight. Your powers have been taken away by the Act. What I'm very happy to do is meet with Councillor Duncan outside of the meeting, see if I can find some way of getting that information to her from Affinity Water or the Environment Agency that might then help inform future debate. But unfortunately, your hands are tied. Thank you.
Thank you. I do think that would be helpful, because I do think that residents would want that information. And the last point I wanted to make, I don't think it's going to be a planning matter, but it's just been drawn to my attention that the contract is heavily invested in by Oleg Deripaska, who is linked to Putin, and apparently measures are going through Parliament at the moment to not fund Russian oligarchs, and presumably HS2 may have some of its funding withdrawn or sequestered even because of this.
I think the point is made, but it's not something we're prepared to discuss as a committee this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you
for your points. Any other indications to speak? Councillor Yarrow.
Thank you, Chairman. Could I just check? Obviously, the Breakspear Road is well known for flooding in what are quite moderate storms. Are the officers happy that the amount of work that's gone into these swales will cope with the volume of water that's going to be pouring down these so-called hills? Because the only place you can go, as you say, is into the River Pin, and then we have problems further down the valley and what have you. So are you happy that enough has been done?
I think I'll let Ian answer that, but I think you covered it off a bit earlier on that. So, but I'll let you just quickly answer Councillor Yarrow's point.
Yeah. So as I said, they're required to keep the status quo. The modelling has indicated that is the case, and there is obviously future work that we're going to do to try and reduce the amount of water going to the Pin, because it is a hot spot of concern. There is also works going on the Breakspear Road South that HS2 are doing, and whilst they're doing that works, we are improving the drainage on Breakspear Road South at the same time. So although they're not required to do that, it is a logical decision to do, as opposed to a public authority coming back in later on to do exactly the same work later. So some of that should satisfy us.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Well, I've got Councillor Cawthorne and Councillor Higgins.
Just a very quick point. I do sympathise with the point made by Councillor Duncan about the Environment Agency. I have no faith in them whatsoever. I've been doing battles with them since 2005 around air quality in that part of the borough. However, it's not before us this evening. I would be interested to know what comes out of the discussions with Glenn at a later date. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Higgins?
Yeah, maybe Abramovich will use his money to help us build HS2. There you go, sell Chelsea, and there we go. So it's very strange to hear the opposition talk about the Soviet Union in that manner. But anyway, we will go forward. I would just, with a heavy heart, obviously, I will move what's before us. I mean, totally against the whole scheme, but there you go. Anyway, well, that's all I'll say.
We've got what we've got. Thank you, Councillor Higgins. Anybody else indicating to speak? We are moved. Councillor Chapman?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm more than happy to... Well, I reluctantly second it because I don't like the scheme either, and if it collapses because of other events, I'd be more than happy with that. I did have concerns regarding the maintenance of the mounds, but Ian's covered that very well, and you'll be glad to know you spared my monologue about growing up in Yorkshire next to slag heaps and stuff. On that basis, I'm more than happy to second. Am I allowed to still say slag heaps nowadays? I'm not sure.
I'm more strike that from the record,
Chairman. Thank you.
And I'm sure members and anybody watching on YouTube was looking forward to your monologue on Yorkshire Hills. But we won't go there on this occasion. Okay, we are moved and we are seconded on this application. I'm not seeing anybody else indicate to speak, so can I take a show of hands in favour of approval, please? Is that abstention?
I'm abstaining, yes, Chair.
Okay, so we've got...
Just because I feel concerned about it.
Okay, so we've got five approval and one abstention, Steve. So I can confirm agenda item 6 this evening is approved, and thank you to everybody for a very very good debate that heavily scrutinises this application. That's what we're about here in Hillingdon. So thank you, Ian, for your presentation. We can now move swiftly on to the next two items are out-of-borough consultations. They are for the same site, but we will be taking the presentations separately because they are slightly different in nature. Is everybody settled? You can all now? And I will draw members' attention to an addendum which is in front of you and you would have had by email as well. So if we're all settled, we can now go over to Mandit for agenda item 7. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Agenda item 7 and agenda item 8 are both linked, but I will be presenting them separately. They both relate to the London Borough of Hillingdon's out-of-borough consultation to proposals within Bucks County Council. Sorry, it's not Bucks County Council, it's just Buckinghamshire Council. Yes, that's right. So apologies, I got the wrong title there. The addendum that's before everybody sets out additional air quality comments that have been received by the air quality officer on the application. So the application is located... there is a red line on this plan. I'm just not sure we can see it very well. So it is very... So the red line boundary is extensive, if I'm honest. It's a large portion of the site which runs along the borough boundary. The London Borough of Uxbridge strategic industrial location, positioned just off Rockingham Road, is located just here, as I'm showing on the map, and it's just here. But none of the application site is within the London Borough of Hillingdon, so we are we are consultees on the application, and we are seeking to provide comments to Buckinghamshire Council about the proposals. The application is proposing a new data centre park. It is proposing what is known as a hyperscale data centre park, so it's to serve, I think it's something like a handful of large data centre requirers, so large companies such as Amazon and Google are generally the type of providers who would take a quantum of floor space on this scale. That's not to say that that's who the applicant, the proposals are for. We're not aware. This is just an application seeking permission for what is 3 very large data centre buildings with up to 163,000 square metres of floor area. The application does have backup generators as part of the development, so the primary issues raised by the air quality officer relate to these backup generators. You'll notice that obviously with the location of this site on the borough boundary, the impact from the generators and from the development per se are primarily on the London Borough of Hillingdon residents. And for that reason, the air quality officer has actually raised an objection, so it would be a third objection to add to the comments that we intend to send to Buckinghamshire Council. Now, we had a lengthy conversation with the air quality officer, so she has, on the 3rd page of your addendum, set out a damage cost of circa £5.3 million. Now, in normal circumstances, within development within the London Borough of Hillingdon, when we secure money for mitigation, be it air quality, carbon offset, whatever it's for, we are able to then use that money to alleviate the harm that's created. In this instance, we would be given £5.3 million, and I'm not sure how we would then use that money to alleviate the harm to the residents who are affected. So in this instance, we're not seeking, per se, the planning obligation, even if it's via a request from Buckinghamshire Council. We're just raising an objection due to the fundamental harm. The reason that the damage cost is so high and the harm is so great is because the generators that are proposed are not the best that could be proposed. So there are alternative technologies that could be deployed which are more expensive, and for that reason we are refusing outright and hoping that they will, we are objecting outright, not refusing, and hoping that Buckinghamshire Council will be able to negotiate cleaner, more appropriate methods of backup generators. So we have 3 large data centres here, and then we have district heating network, which is also proposed. Now, I believe that members of the planning committee have been sent correspondence by the agent for this application. It would have come through yesterday or today, notifying us that they didn't consider that the council had adequately considered the proposals for a district heat network in the broader consideration. Now, the addendum on the 4th page does set out that whilst it was not explicitly referenced within the committee report, the objection broadly on provision of accommodation or facilities within the Greenbelt is an objection and included that of the district heat network. We accept that obviously a district heat network is supported, but it could be delivered on a brownfield site, as could the data centre buildings themselves. So there remains an objection. That does not outweigh the harm of the development, so it's not being added as an additional reason. It's already contained within the current objections within the committee report. The application site is all fully within the Greenbelt, so that primarily focuses on the main objection that's set out in the recommendation on page number 30. The second being the design, because the size of these buildings is circa 20 metres, and I believe it's possibly taller if you take account of flues, etc. So it is a significant size and scale. We have taken some, we have got some photographs from 2 viewpoints. I'm just going to point out where these viewpoints are before we start going through them. One of them is slightly further down on the footpath, which runs north to south between the borough boundary, and one of them is slightly further up. So that's just here on the footpath, and then just here. So point number 1 is the one that's furthest south. So in this view, which is looking south, there would be limited views of the development. Looking west, however, this would be, you would significantly see the development of the 3 data centres, as well as the battery facility, which is the next application. Again, looking north, whilst there is a lot of screening, quite possibly if you're looking directly north and not looking over to your left, you might not see the development. If we move to point 2, now from this point, when you're looking south, you would actually see the development because you're further along the footpath. So the amount that you would see from the London Borough of Hillingdon is quite significant, hence the reason that we have the design reason for refusal separate to the Greenbelt reason for refusal. Again, the impact on this view looking west would be significant, as would the impact on this view looking north from the second point further up the footpath. I'm happy to take questions, but we now have 3 objections that we will be passing to the London Borough, to Buckinghamshire Council, 1 relating to air quality, 1 relating to the Greenbelt, and 1 relating to design. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mandip. Again, I think we need to remind ourselves and members that this is an out-of-borough consultation. We are not looking to approve or refuse. We're looking to object or otherwise, which will be then considered by Buckinghamshire County Council. We are not the determining authority on this application. But what I have done, I was contacted by a ward councillor, Councillor Burrows, who has requested that he would be allowed to speak on this matter. Using my discretion as chairman, I've allowed that because of the proximity it is to Uxbridge South. So I'm going to invite Councillor Burrows, and I certainly do not need to give Councillor Burrows the speech on the traffic lights, because I know he's used the system and been sat in this chair many, many times. So, but you do have 3 minutes, Councillor, and we will be timing you. So when you start speaking, we'll start the clock. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for using your discretion, allowing me to address the committee this evening. We have to remind ourselves that this isn't the first development on our borders from Buckinghamshire that we've given objection to, and we've actually seen those developments unfortunately go through and progress. However, this actual data site will have significant impact on my current ward, Uxbridge South, and the rest of Uxbridge, because the site itself is huge. It will have detrimental effect on the Greenbelt, which is already mentioned. But on top of that, it would also expose the rest of the Greenbelt sites across London to the similar sort of exposure that this data site would get if approved. I feel that officers' comments are balanced and valid. I think they're very valid, the green belt, the design, and now the air quality. And if you have a look in the summary, on page 29.1, it says the development may also include cycle and car parking, internal circulation routes. May, to me, when I see in an application, is nothing saying that it will include these. I also feel that it will increase traffic flows through our borough, which will be added to air pollution, not just from the site itself. And also the fact that we have plans as well for housing, etc. This is going to affect the whole of this area and this borough going forward. So I would hope that this committee does approve the objections that are being put forward by officers this evening. As I say, they are balanced, they are within planning law, and they are within our own planning regulations as well. And I hope that Buckinghamshire this time actually take note from Hillingdon and from its planning committee, because as you mentioned already, Mr Chairman, we do take care of our residents, and that's why we are going to raise these objections. So thank you for allowing me to speak, and I would hope that the committee do support officers in these objections and moving forward for London Borough of Hillingdon. Thank you, Mr Chairman.
Okay, thank you. And with time to spare. Well done. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Okay, right. Again, just to remind members, we are not the determining authority here, and we have had a third objection verbally updated as well. So that's what we're considering, the two objections in the report, plus a third objection, which is included in the addendum. So I've got Councillor Higgins, followed by Councillor Cawthorne, followed by Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chairman. Why are we not taking the money? That's the first question. I would like to take the money. That's the first thing. Anything like this, if it goes through, then at least we have something to have that would be a mitigate, so you can explain why we decided not to. I'm surprised in this. I'm surprised that it hasn't been dug in. We've got some landfill over at HS2. You could have thrown it on the top of it, made a nice mound, and it could have been underground. The main thing is that generator. If that's not work, that's going to be, most generators now are diesel. They're nothing else. But so I'm happy with the objections, but I would like to know why we haven't taken the money. Thank you.
So the question from Councillor Higgins is about the money.
So we're not saying we do not want the money. What we are saying is we have an outright objection to the harm caused by the development and our borough residents. Because we are not the determining authority, we are technically not entitled to the air quality damage cost. Now, air quality policies are slightly different in Hillingdon to Bucks, primarily because we are an air quality management area. So the reason the sum is in our report is to report that there is significant and detrimental harm to our residents, and we will, should the application move towards a positive recommendation, seek to influence the quantum of air quality that we might be able to negotiate from Bucks. Bucks will invariably have their own sum. They may say that of the 5.3 million, only 2.6 is justifiable to give to us. I'm plucking numbers out of the air, but they will also want to keep some for themselves because the development is in their borough. So it will be a discussion close down the line, but I'm hoping that we won't get to approval, and therefore it's not a conversation. That's why our initial proposals are an outright objection on air quality and harm.
And I think to add to that point is that we would not be in control or have any influence over those 106 discussions whatsoever. So it could be that, it could be nothing. So do you want to come back on that, Councillor Higgins?
I do. If there is harm, we will get something. That will happen. But the thing is, how do we get to the 5? Is the other authority came to the 5 million thing, or did we make it up?
We base the sum on the damage cost from the development, and it's based on a department. It's on DEFRA's auto calculation, number of units, generators proposed. Not units here, size of the floor area. So there is an automatic calculator, and it ups the values if you're in air quality management areas. So if Bucks were to do a similar sum using the same calculator, I think they would have a different value I could propose that we add an informative that if this moves towards a positive recommendation by Bucks, that we would then wish to be involved in a conversation about air quality contributions. Yep.
I'm getting a few nods on that one, so we'll certainly include that when we wrap up. Councillor Higgins, a final point?
Yeah, that's
from
fine.
you?
Thank you very much. And yeah, with that, lovely informative, and I will move with officer's recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Right, I've got Councillor Cawthorne, followed by Councillor Mathers.
Thank you. It's a good report. It's a good summary of the key areas of objection, and I support those, as well as concur with the comments made by Councillor Burrows in his submission. A question really about process here. The communication we had has been alluded to from the agent around this question of the district heat network. That is something which is entirely not something for us to consider. That gets thrown into the sequential test process carried out by the LPS. Nothing to do with us, just to be clear. But presumably, although we're not privy to that process, because that's Buckinghamshire Council, we've nevertheless made our own assessment of where this is likely to sit against the National Planning Policy Framework. Is that a fair summary of the position? Okay, thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Mathers?
Thank you, Chair. I guess my summary of this is that we understand the need for data centres, we understand that we're in a digital world and these sites that we use and other spaces that we need it, but just the inappropriate placing of it and the impact on Hillingdon is far beyond any benefit that residents may receive. And I think that the green belt alone is the one that stands out to me. My question is around, so because the air calculation, quality harm calculations are based on backup generators, how much that's taken into consideration? Because my understanding is with data centres is that they only need them when there's a power failure, and so they kick in. And is there also an aspect around noise that could affect our residents that could add to and strengthen the objection on this? Because backup generators, when it's maybe it's the electric hum you might hear from the data centre 1 minute, suddenly kicks in at 3 in the morning because there's a power cut. How much that might impact residents who across that plane could probably hear a significant amount.
I think we're just looking, it is included in the addendum, but we'll let
there's
a
paragraph in the addendum that might help partly answer that. It's on the top of the second page that there's actually a significant number, 171 diesel backup generators, and you've got the lifetime of the development proposal. So there's various factors in play that have affected. I totally get the point you're making, but specific to this case, there's various factors that the air quality officer's taken into account, such as the sheer number of generators that I think come into play. But Mandate's going to add to it.
So I understand what you mean, that the generators only kick in the event of a failure. However, they are required to be tested to make sure that they could kick in as and when they are needed. So there is a proportion of testing, and actually that's where the damage that's what the damage cost relates to. The noise from the generators, it was considered. However, because the adjoining site next to us is an industrial site, it's a bit too far away from residents to say that would be a harm.
You okay with that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's just the general noise elevation. I'm not saying that Uxbridge is noisy, but with an industrial state there is a noise, and at what point it tips the balance of acceptable when there's a constant adding to the noise contribution.
I'm happy to take that because the generators are only tested once a month, and hopefully the backup would not run indefinitely in the event of a closure. I don't feel like it's a valid concern that we could raise, but air quality is definitely a solid one.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, mine was about the noise, so that point's been covered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm not seeing any other members indicate. We are moved. Anyone want to take me forward on this? Councillor Duncan? So you're happy to second. So we are moved and seconded to approve officer's recommendation to object to this scheme. Can I take a show of hands, please? So that's unanimous. So we can say that agenda item 7 this evening is approved to object to this scheme. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We can now move swiftly on to agenda item 8, which you heard earlier is the same site, a slightly different configuration of what we're actually going to be talking about here. So I'm going to ask Mandy to take us through Probably don't need to go through the whole site again, but just actually talk about the specifics on this part of the application. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 8 relates solely to a new battery storage facility, which would invariably be linked to the last item that we discussed. So it's a much smaller area of land, predominantly to the north of what would be the otherwise the data park. It's a development that's only 4 metres in height, I believe, to its roof, so it's not of a significant scale, but it would be visible and is not appropriate in the Greenbelt, hence the reason that the current officer's recommendation is 2 reasons for refusal. We have had further air quality comments, however, because of the nature of the facility being just a battery facility, there are no air quality objections on this application. So, as per the officer recommendation on page 44, we are recommending an objection on Greenbelt grounds and design grounds for this proposed battery facility. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Duncan, you got just in there before Councillor Higgins.
I'm very happy with this report and recommendation. I move the recommendation. I don't have any question.
Thank you very much, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Higgins?
I would love to second this. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else indicate that they want to speak, so we're moved and seconded. We can go to the vote. Can I take a show of hands, please? Okay, so that's unanimous that we approve the recommendation to object to agenda item 8 this evening. Okay, right, that concludes this evening's meeting. Thank you very much for officers supporting us this evening. Thank you very much for members for participating and again putting in some very good scrutiny and some excellent questions on behalf of Hillingdon's residents. So thank you very much for your support this evening. I'd just like to say thank you to anybody who's been watching us on YouTube, and we will now cut the feed and wish everyone a good evening. Thank you.